It is now my honor to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. The Right Honorable Lord Christopher Patten of Barnes' professional career has been a rather busy and successful one. Throughout his career, he has held a number of prominent and uniquely challenging positions. These include member of British Parliament and the European Commission, last governor of Hong Kong, where he managed the handover to China, and chair of the Independent Commission for Policing in Northern Ireland, where he set up a new police service. Lord Patten is currently the Chancellor of the University of Oxford and also the chairman of the BBC Trust. Here tonight to discuss what lies ahead for U.S. and European relations in these interesting economic times, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Right Honorable Lord Christopher Patten. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me back to San Francisco. I must say that being invited back to San Francisco is like being invited back to Florence or Venice or one of the other great cities in the world. One doesn't say no. So thank you for giving me an excuse to come back to one of the most beautiful cities in the world. I'm pleased to be here at what is such a, I think the euphemism is challenging time for the Western democracies. Some of you may know the story of Woody Allen, who announced that he had just done a speed reading course, and he said that he'd read War and Peace in 20 minutes. It's about Russia, he said. Those of you who spent more than 20 minutes on War and Peace, and those of you who, unlike me, read in full the essays during the course of that great novel about Tolstoy's view of history, will recall that he was obsessively interested in what constituted power in what we now call geopolitical relationships. Now, Tolstoy, I don't think ever got round in trying to understand how Napoleon and the French had done so well until the snow intervened in dealing with Mother Russia. He didn't get round to demography and economics. But it seems to me that when you look back over the last centuries, millennia, it's that relationship between demography, between population growth and per capita wealth creation, which most determine power in shaping our world. Until 1820, China and India represented about 50% of global output. China about 33%, India 16 or 17%. And that was largely a consequence of the fact that they were incomparably the two largest countries in the world. But since probably the 16th century, their per capita creation of wealth had been falling in relation to Europe. From 1820 onwards, Europe and North America surged ahead, so that by the 1970s, 1980s, China and India were probably 7-8% of global output, of global wealth. The 19th century was largely dominated by Europe. And that was partly a consequence, again, of that relationship between the size of Europe and what was happening to European economies. The European population increased as a share of the world's population from 1/5 to 1/4. And that accounted partly for Europe's colonial imperial adventure, and it also, it has to be said, probably accounted for the subsequent struggles in Europe for elbow room. Europe, which dominated the 19th century, then tore itself to shreds in the first part of the 20th century, with America coming to the aid of Europe both in 1418 and in 3945, but on the second occasion insisting that it would only stay in Europe with a security shield, provided that Europe turned its back on the xenophobic nationalism which had produced 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century. So Europe's position in the global league tables diminished, and America, by the middle of the 20th century, was the predominant global power. It's worth pointing out, just as a footnote as one looks ahead, that America is the only rich country whose population will increase over the first half of the 21st century. Otherwise, the population increase is likely to be in the poorest countries, and in particular in Africa. But in the middle of the 20th century, there's America as the world's only real superpower. Some people have suggested the imperium of the world, more like the emporium of the world. The world's marketplace, but also the only country in the world which mattered everywhere, and the country which gave the rest of the world a sense of global order in which America, by and large, accepted the same rule book that it wanted to apply to others. Maybe that was a declining sense as the century wore on, but it certainly existed at the beginning and for most of the following decades. I guess ever since Vietnam and Watergate and the energy crisis and the decade of stagflation in the 70s, ever since then, America has increasingly been obsessed with the sense that it's in decline. For anybody outside, that seems a fairly absurd proposition. America is still the most vibrant economy by and large in the world. America still has the most formidable soft power in the world, with, for example, 42 out of the world's top 50 universities, with extraordinary magnetic pulling power for the world's best and brightest, so that 75% of the PhDs which are written in science subjects in America this year are being written by foreigners. Go to Silicon Valley, which all of you will know better than I do, and you can tell me how many of the startups in Silicon Valley are the result of the intellectual endeavors of first-generation Americans or immigrants. So all that is spectacularly important, and America still matters more than anybody else. But for outsiders, and for Americophiles like me, I guess the worry one has at the moment is that a country that we've always associated with a can-do lifestyle seems increasingly to suffer under a can't-do politics. And many of the problems which we read Americans identifying, like falling standards in schools, like declining infrastructure standards. I pointed out to a group of my colleagues from the BBC today that the broadband in America is now slower than it is in Greece. Those sort of issues, it seems, politicians have greater difficulty in overcoming than might have been the case 20 or 30 years ago. And that's at a time when America is having to come to terms with the fact that the American economy as a share of the global economy has fallen fairly precipitately. I first came to America in 1965. I first came to San Francisco in 1965, went on to Los Angeles and was there during the Watts riots. And then America represented 38% of the world's GDP. That had fallen to about 30% by the end of the century, and it's now about 22 or 23%. So you can't deny that America has had a falling share of global economic strength. And it's particularly dramatic when you compare America with China. In 2000, the Chinese economy was 1/8 the size of America's. Today, the Chinese economy is over 40% the size of America's. I don't think that justifies the suggestion that America has had it. Far from it. But what I think the American administration and others know is that America can no longer boss the global agenda or lead the global agenda on its own in the same way that it did for the 50 years after the Second World War. And that has huge implications for us in Europe. In Europe, we were the junior partner in that endeavor, sometimes piggybacking on American economic strength and above all on America's preparedness to bear the largest share of the burden of securing the world's peace. America has dominated and still dominates the global commons, land, air, sea, space, through its technological, military hardware, and its preparedness to use that. Europe tends to be written off, particularly by Europeans. But we go a little too far. Europe, with 7% of the world's population, still has a larger share of world output than the United States. And surprisingly, that hasn't changed very much over the last 10 or 15 years. Europe is still responsible for the largest share of world exports, about 18%. And Europe has established an extremely successful single economic market, single trade policy, single environmental policy, involving, to an extraordinary degree, the sharing of sovereignty with binding dispute settlement machinery, which I think are difficult to find parallels for in international history. The problems for Europe are twofold. First of all, there is the extent to which ambition and rhetorical ambition have run ahead of democratic legitimacy and our ability to carry public opinion with us. And that's perhaps most obvious in the context of the Eurozone crisis. Harry Truman, as you know, used to have on his desk a little sign which said, "The buck stops here." What people tend to forget is the other side of the sign said, "I'm from Missouri." And in Europe, there isn't a buck. There isn't a buck in the sense of Europeans agreeing to give away responsibility for the most important political issues over tax or spending or education or health to a supranational authority. And the reason for that is I'm from Missouri, or actually in my case, I'm from England. The euro depended on the assumption that Germany and Greece and Spain and Italy would all turn out to be much the same. From 1995 to 2008, the cost of domestically produced goods in Greece went up by 67%, in Spain by 56%, in Portugal by 51%, in Italy by over 40%, in Germany by 9%. Now that's unsustainable in the longer term. If there's an imbalance between Rhode Island and New Jersey, or between Massachusetts and Arizona, it doesn't matter. You have the same central bank, you have the same federal tax and spend policies, but we don't have that in Europe. You can't run a currency successfully without a fiscal union, and you can't run a fiscal union without a transfer union. In other words, without the willingness of people in the countries which are doing better to bail out the bits of the union which are doing less well, or oblige those countries to behave like the richer countries. So at what point are our Greek friends going to become German? At what point are the Spaniards going to become German? Now, I think this is a crisis which has been produced by politicians and by the gulf, the disjuncture between rhetoric and economic reality. There's another longer-term crisis which I think is a little more worrying, and that is the extent of our preparedness to face up to the challenges of competitiveness in the years that lie ahead. My favorite European political novel is Giuseppe de Lampedusa's The Leopard, which is a great novel about Italy, about Sicily, in the middle of the 19th century. And one of the characters in the novel, Tancredi, says at one point, things, I haven't quite got it right, but this is a rough translation, things have to change in order to remain the same. And that is something which Europeans are extremely reluctant to accept. We think, in my judgment, correctly, that we probably have the highest quality of life across the board in social terms of any group of countries in the world. Social entitlements, environmental quality, and so on. But we're very, very reluctant to accept that we have to earn those entitlements and that we have to make changes in the fields of labor markets, social welfare, health service, payments for these social programs, very reluctant to accept that we have to make changes in order to pay for all that. We're very reluctant to use a Chinese expression to smash the iron rice bowl. So I think we have some big challenges in the years ahead, and they're not made any easier by the pusillanimity of European politicians. The chairman of the Eurogroup group of finance ministers, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Mr. Jean-Paul Juncker, said about 18 months ago, when he was asked why European politicians weren't doing more to deal with our long-term competitiveness problems, he said, we know what we need to do, but we don't know how we'd get re-elected if we did it. Which is, I guess, a definition of leadership in our days. Now, that seems to me to be a not wholly unfair description of the American and European economies against the backdrop of the remarkable emergence, which we might talk about a bit in questions, of the emerging economies. The emerging economies are what we used to call the third world until the 1970s, early 1980s. Emerging economies was a phrase invented by the International Financial Corporation of the World Bank in order to get away from the third world concept, which brought to mind cheap toys, polyester shirts, Soviet tractors, corruption, and the attempts by poor countries to gang up on rich through something called the New International Economic Order, in which cartels of commodity producers would put pressure on rich countries. That was all changed because the poorer countries came to the conclusion that they could cope best by making peace with capitalism and by actually producing goods and services at a cheaper price than rich countries could do it. And that's why India has been, to some extent, transformed, with the Indian middle class increasing exponentially in size, and with the Indians producing some world-class multinational corporations, Tata, Infosys, Reliance, Rambaxi, and others, and with the Indians in every area in which the government isn't involved, showing their ability as hustlers to manage extraordinarily well economically. The Indians still have awful problems, corruption, the criminalization of politics, social inequity, with the largest number of very poor people in the world living in India, weak infrastructure, but they cope partly by the federalization of the economy and politics, by which I mean that there are bits of India which work quite well, even if the center isn't taking any decisions. China, when I first saw it in 1979, exported in a year about the same amount as it exports today in a day. China now makes in a fortnight what in the 1980s it used to make in a year. China is the largest exporter in the world, the largest maker of steel. The biggest growth in energy is in China, and China also makes more sombreros than Mexico. Across the board, China is a hugely important player, but China faces some huge issues, some huge problems today. How can it change its economic model from one which is so dominated by exporting manufacturing industry and puts more emphasis on domestic consumption and investment. From 97 to 2007, at a time when the Chinese were producing spectacular figures for economic growth, the share in the economy of income fell from 53 to 40%. It's a definition of communism for you. Most of the resources going into profits, corporate profits, and the reserves of the finance ministry, rather than into people's pay packets. China faces huge environmental problems. China faces big problems of social inequity, with the Gini coefficient, as it's called, showing a bigger gap between the rich and the poor in China than any other country. And China also, I think this is manifested in part by the recent Bo Xilai case, has an existential problem, which is how it is to continue to grow economically while retaining an iron grip on politics. I don't think Leninist markets actually go on indefinitely, and nor, it seems, does Premier Wen Jiabao. So, Europe and America face some huge problems in the next few years, but I don't think they're confronted by an economic model in China which is likely to be more successful in the long term. What I think Europe and America have to do is to continue to believe in the operation of markets under the rule of law, but to do so with more courageous leadership and more coherence than they've managed over the last few years. I think we've been complacent and smug, and perhaps the area where that is most true is in the area of education and investment in research and development. In Europe in the last few years, we had a big row, a big argument about competition from workers in the countries which newly joined the European Union. We had a big argument about whether Polish plumbers were intolerable competition in our countries, in France and Germany and the United Kingdom. As Chancellor of a great university, it didn't ever seem to me that Polish plumbers were the issue. At Oxford, 30% of our mathematicians are Chinese. That's the competition. Over to you.
I will thank you for your remarks. We have a whole series of questions. The topics are not limited to your remarks. I think some people arrived with questions because of your extraordinary career and the many different posts you've had. But I want to start with Hong Kong and China. Yeah. You've been given very high marks for the manner in which you dealt with the mainland Chinese government and its supporters in Hong Kong in managing the handover, particularly in your efforts to extend voting rights for the Legislative Council and related issues. How do you feel things have gone since the handover for the people of Hong Kong? Not so much economically, because I think everyone agrees that they've prospered, but also, or really more importantly, as it relates to the rule of law, the development of their government, essential freedoms, and so forth.
Well, first of all, I think the praise for what I tried to do for democracy in Hong Kong is exaggerated. I think that all I tried to do was to ensure that an agreed and excessively limited process of democratization was as clean and fair as possible. I think I had a bigger effect in two areas. First of all, one of my colleagues on the Executive Council described what I was trying to do as tutorial government, by which what he meant was encouraging people to see the relationship between the freedoms which they'd begun to take for granted and their economic success. I think there is a depth of citizenship, or a sense of citizenship in Hong Kong, which has been enormously important to Hong Kong's continuing success. So that Hong Kong has all the software and hardware of a liberal society, except for the ability to elect its own government, and that it will get in due course. The other thing which I really put a huge amount of energy into, with a lot of support, it has to be said, from the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, much more support from the American Chamber of Commerce than from some of my compatriots, was the attempt to safeguard civil liberties and the independence of the judiciary. I remember one fight we had late on, which some officials, some former officials in the Foreign Office regarded as a ridiculous argument to have, was over whether there should be foreign judges on the Court of Final Appeal. Now, we actually fought to have two external judges from other common law jurisdictions on the Supreme Court in Hong Kong. Eventually, the Chinese backed off on the issue because we were getting close to 1997. In fact, one of the things which has kept Hong Kong clean and prosperous is the fact that there are still independent courts. There's still a legal system which works extraordinarily well, and that is partly, I think, because of the efforts we made. It's above all thanks to the leadership of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Andrew Lee, who's been a great servant of the rule of law. So I think those things together, the sense of citizenship which exists in Hong Kong. So when a government 4 or 5 years ago tried to introduce a law on subversion, there were 600,000-700,000 people on the streets. And today, however mighty people are, they're brought down if there's any sense of corruption or behaving badly. The last election campaigns were dominated by the reporting of a local media which is rambunctious but free.
You've stated that Hong Kong might be a useful example for mainland China in terms of closing what you have referred to as the accountability gap in Chinese society. How do you view the current situation in China in terms of political reform, the succession of their leadership, and so forth? Could you comment on that?
A couple of years ago, there was a big argument which was reflected in the communist papers in Hong Kong, Wei Wen-po and Ta Kung Pao, which very often are used by factions in Beijing to conduct their arguments. And there was an argument between the so-called modernizers and the so-called hardliners. The hardliners were saying, you can't go on allowing foreigners a bigger part in the mainland economy, and you can't go on privatizing state-owned enterprises, even though state-owned enterprises are a drag on productivity. Because if the party continues to retreat from controlling the economy, sooner or later the party will lose control over the state. The modernizers, who I'm pleased to say were led by the bankers, the modernizers were arguing unless the party withdraws from control over the economy, we won't be able to attract as much foreign investment, productivity won't rise as fast, and we will see the economic growth rate flagging. We won't create as many jobs, and in those circumstances, sooner or later, the party will lose control over the state. And the Chinese dilemma is that it seems to me that both those propositions are entirely correct. And the challenge for the leadership is to find a way of bridging that. And to some extent, it's, I guess, the most important argument which is probably being conducted at present behind the velvet curtain. Yes, Bo Xilai was plainly brought down because he was too tall a poppy, because he was breaking the rules of consensus politics and trying to elbow his way into a top job. But there's a lot more to that argument than just one man's ambition. And whether Xi Jinping is capable of leading China in the sort of direction which Wen Jiabao has plainly advocated is the big question for us. Look, I mean no disrespect, and I speak not the sort of thing I'm supposed to say as a tremendous, I'm a European, I would say this, wouldn't I? A great admirer of your present president's intellectual capacity. But I think my future is going to be far more determined by what Xi Jinping is like than by the next 4 years. And the trouble is, I haven't got the faintest idea what Xi Jinping believes in or why he's emerged in probably one of the two most important jobs in the world. Why? Because of who his father was? Because of some extraordinary balance between princelings and those who were part of the Young Communist League. I mean, why is Xi Jinping in that position? None of us knows.
How will the next leader of Hong Kong be selected, just as a factual matter?
Well, the factual answer is that the basic law, which is the PRC's political agenda for China, says that the next elections should be universal suffrage for the leader. So I guess that'll happen.
Okay. Turning to Europe.
Mind you, there are elections and elections. I remember when I was getting into difficulty over elections, somebody saying to me, a supporter of the Xinhua news agency's position, saying to me, "But you don't understand, we're not against elections, we just want to know the result beforehand."
Turning to Europe, we've had 2 or 3 questions on the role of the UK, given the fact that, after all, you are outside the euro. So the question really boils down to, can Britain credibly maintain a leadership position on European financial and economic issues without joining the euro?
Well, the interesting thing is that the City of London has retained its central role with, I suppose, Frankfurt in European financial affairs, despite the fact that Britain is outside the euro, and to some extent, perhaps because we're outside the euro. My own judgment is that the Eurozone crisis, muted at the moment, will fetch up by the end with a strong and a weak currency, with a strong and a weak euro. That there'll be a common currency and a single harder currency. And as happens with the dollar in parts of Latin America, the strong currency will drive out the weaker, or the weaker be used by more than the stronger. And in those circumstances, Britain may not seem such a ridiculous outsider. What Britain has at the moment, even with a higher budget deficit than Spain, is the ability to manage its own interest rates and its own policies according to its own local circumstances. And that's, how would the Spanish or the Greeks or the Italians or the Portuguese have got out of their present predicament historically? It's not very grand, but they'd have allowed the currency to slide and they'd have inflated. Now, at the end of the day, it wouldn't have left them a stronger competitive economy in comparison with the Germans. But at the moment, you have the markets asking these countries to do things which the markets, which another part of the markets, know are going to make them lousy places to invest in. You tell the Spanish that they've got to engage in more austerity and throw more people out of work. And then when you look at the consequences of greater austerity, you say to yourself, do we really want to lend them any more money? But do we really want to invest any more money there? So I think that we're heading inexorably for a common currency in some countries at a lower level than a single currency in others.
In the past, you've been an advocate for the admission of Turkey to the EU. And my question is whether, given the current state of affairs, that's realistic politically, particularly in light of the requirement for unanimous approval of new members and some opposition to Turkey's admission in certain countries in Europe.
Well, I fear that you may be right, but if I can sound very French and use the word existential for the second time this evening, I think the question of whether or not we accept Turkish membership, if Turkey makes the reforms which are necessary in order to qualify for European membership, I think that if in those circumstances we reject the Turkish application, then it will have a profound effect on Europe's significance in the world and Europe's ability to convince America and our other friends that we actually matter very much. If you look at Turkey in economic terms, would I prefer my pension to be invested in Turkey or several of our colleagues in the European Union that I can think of? Turkey. Turkey is for demographic, geographical reasons, for reasons of its military capacity and its preparedness, like Britain and France actually, to accept body bags. For all those reasons, Turkey is a very, very serious country. Turkey is a secular Islamic democracy. And if at the end of the day, as bishops say, we say no to Turkey, what will be the reason? The reason will be that they're Muslims.
I'd like to turn to the BBC.
Yeah, so would I.
One of the questions is how does the BBC deal with the issue of fairness or balance in covering political stories or points of view? an issue in this country that we seem to struggle with?
Well, it's a very good question. And the BBC is consistently charged by centre-left governments of being centre-right, and by centre-right governments of being centre-left. So that we were very unpopular with the Blair government. Indeed, the leadership of the BBC was defenestrated because the BBC got wrong about the only thing in the run-up to the Iraq War on which Mr. Blair was telling the truth. So the BBC wasn't then regarded as a liberal lefty organisation. Now it's attacked by some conservatives as liberal and lefty. But what is particularly satisfying is that the polls give measures of support to the BBC for its accuracy and impartiality. Well, it's balance rather than its impartiality, because the public know that impartiality is a very difficult concept both to define and to live up to. But the BBC's score in terms of fairness and accuracy in comparison with other media organisations looks like an election result in the Warsaw Pact. I mean, we outdo any other organisation by a margin of 57-7. We outdo the Times and most of the press by a margin of 57-58-2. I mean, they're huge, huge figures. The BBC is trusted, and the BBC is trusted around the world. The World Service is trusted as a balanced provider of the news. My argument inside the BBC is very simple. I say, you leave me to argue with people who say we're left-wing or right-wing. I'm happy with that. Your job is to be better, because I think our delivery of the news should be better. I think we should be, and I'm not just saying this because I'm in San Francisco, I think we should be more prepared to determine our own agenda rather than have it determined by others. I think we underreport what's happening in Asia. So I don't want the BBC to become obsessed with whether it's left or right wing. I want it to be absolutely obsessed with whether its journalism is of a profound enough quality. Because whether it's our online journalism or the World Service or the contribution we make to public service broadcasting in this country and others, or our BBC America, what's really important is that we should be seen to be accurate and balanced and a national broadcaster, but not a state broadcaster.
And as I understand it, the BBC does not take advertising.
We take some advertising on our online services and on some of our international commercial channels, but we don't take any advertising domestically. And I'd be strongly opposed to allowing into British broadcasting. There is an overall regulator. I'm the regulator of the BBC, though in some areas, for example, decency, I share that, and commercial areas, I share that regulation with an organisation called the Office of Communications, or Ofcom, to give it its acronym. Ofcom regulates balance across the sector. I regulate balance within the BBC. But I would be hugely opposed to the government saying to the telecommunications, the media regulator, okay, you can allow Fox and shock jock broadcasting on British airwaves. I think that would be a serious step backwards.
I have a question from an Oxford grad. And the question is simply whether Oxford will be able to maintain the tutorial model of education going forward, given the costs and budgetary pressures that are currently being experienced.
Yes, but it's expensive. It costs us 8,000 or 9,000 for every undergraduate we teach. And where colleges and the university find that from within our endowment. So I sometimes say to people, we could be a really successful, big profit business if we stopped teaching anybody. But it's not really the point. No, I think the tutorial experience is so important a part of our collective life, of our collegiate life, and of what we offer students, that we couldn't possibly abandon it. If you talk to most people who've been to Oxford, they remember a lot fondly, but one of the things they most remember is their contact with their teachers, challenging them in social situations where there is no place to hide. I can remember my very first tutorial. I arrived, clever clogs, 18, in a college where I was studying history, where there were 4 fellows, 4 tutors, 3 of whom were world class, really world class. And I went for my first tutorial on medieval history, and I had to read an essay on Charlemagne. The tutor, who was a wonderful, then young man, with a predilection for nasty little black cheroots and Oxford thick-cut marmalade, and a stammer. He would wander around his study while you were reading an essay, puffing on this cheroot, and occasionally going over to a jar of marmalade and sticking a finger in and licking his finger ruminatively. And I went in with my tutorial colleague and sat down, and he said, "Mr. Patten, could you read us your essay?" And I began, I still remember with shame, saying, "Charlemagne can truly be called the founder of modern Europe." And I heard my tutor, who'd by this stage wandered behind me, saying, I beg your pardon." And it was the beginning of a very long, and I think happy period of learning about cliché and thinking for yourself. And
one last question. You, I believe, first came to America, or at least came to America to study. I think it was in 1965, and you worked for John Lindsay.
Yep.
Do you have a story or an experience you can relate about your time with Mayor Lindsay in American politics, and how that influenced you to choose a career in politics rather than law or some other career? Or had you already decided at that point in your life that you planned to be a conservative politician and someday serve in Parliament and so forth?
No, I wasn't remotely political at university. I played quite a lot of games. I slept a lot. I did a bit of work. I acted. I wrote reviews. And I edited a satirical magazine. But I wasn't remotely interested in politics. I went to the Oxford Union, which is the debating chamber for students, and it's supposed to be the nursery for future politicians, once during 3 years at Oxford. No, the first experience I had of politics was working for John Lindsay in the mayoral campaign in 1965. What I most remember about that campaign is not just what a wonderful candidate Lindsay was. I think he was a much better candidate than he was a mayor, which is true of quite a few people. What I most remember is the wit of the small C Conservative candidate William Buckley, who was incredibly funny. I remember when confronted with all the problems of New York, when he was asked on one occasion what would be the first thing he would do if he was elected mayor, I said, demand a recount. Anyway, I came back. I went back to the UK, got a job as a graduate trainee in the BBC for the following autumn, and turned it down to work in politics. So it took me quite a long time to come back to the BBC, a rather circuitous route. But it was I've never planned my career, and my arrival in politics was entirely serendipitous.
Well, thank you very much. On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Northern California, I would like to thank Lord Patten for sharing his insights with us this evening, and thank you, the audience, for your participation. Thank you all for coming. Good night.